Some of the most worthless legendary lords in Total War Warhammer 3. When I say worthless, I mean in the sense that actually playing them as part of their race adds very little, and in fact might actually detract from the experience of playing that particular race. That's how bad some of these legendary lords are. When you have a legendary lord for a race that is so bad that they're taking potentially a really good race and making them into a bad one or a mediocre one, you certainly don't have a great legendary lord on your hands. Now, there's not that many of them that really fit the bill over here in the game. There's a couple that do, however, and we're going to start it with Tzarina Katarin. The baseline legendary lord of Kislev, and funnily enough, the recommended campaign when Warhammer 3 Realms of Chaos came out. Yeah, don't play Katarin. Katarin is quite awful. The only reason you should ever play a campaign as Katarin in ROC is to unlock more resources so you can use him for Immortal Empire, because he's a significantly better legendary lord. Although Castalton also has a substantially better campaign with better faction effects, better possibilities as well. So what is the issue with Katarin when we're thinking about her campaign? Well, her faction effects are as follows. She gets devotion for successful Frost Maiden actions. The reason this is useless is because Frost Maidens are very, very limited as a hero type. And as a result of that, there's basically no situation in which you want the Frost Maiden to do something like assault a unit just to get devotion. I mean, they can wound heroes, but again, their magical ability, they can assassinate lords and heroes, but their magical ability is quite key, and there's very few of them. Like, if you want heroes to do actions on the campaign map, there are significantly better choices available for Kislev. You can get a lot of Patriarchs, you can get a lot of Hag Witches. Frost Maidens, which are very limited with research, just aren't going to add that much. Like, you've got things like Ice Sculpting, and you've got Ice Court Discipline, so you're not going to have a significant number of Ice Witches in the campaign, and increasing the capacity for Ice Witches is not really a great dynamic to deal with. Like, you need to get the Covenant of Ice tier 5 in order to do so. You need to spend a significant amount of gold in order to do so in a Kislev campaign to just get one hero capacity. That is, by the way, one of the worst hero capacity increases in the game. So that benefit for Frost Maiden, hero ranks, Ice or training duration, all of those benefits are pretty useless because, well, you will have a very limited number of Frost Maidens you can have. Now, if you had a significant number of them in a campaign, that would obviously be very different, but when you start with 2 and you can get up to 3 early on, that's not exactly that important. Oh, you can get 3 heroes that will have 4 hero rank initially, and you can train them faster for the Ice Court training system. And also, Katarin is the only legendary lord of Kislev that doesn't have a starting hero in her campaign. Everyone else has a starting hero, and yes, you can use the load save character system to load up a Frost Maiden from the beginning of the campaign. So really, Katarin, she may get 1 starting hero for that character system, but everyone else is going to get 2. Crucially, Boris Ursus and Castalton have replenishment. Ostankia has 2 types of magic that she can get, while she lacks Patriarchs. What about the control benefit? Well, control isn't really that much of a substantial issue for Kislev in a campaign. Kislev's control capability, especially with Purge the Steppes, is fairly significant, so Katarin's benefits on a faction-wide level are not that great. What about the corruption benefit? Well, given the way corruption works, not really. Miscast base chance, kinda, if you're obviously at risk of miscasting spells. But what about the upkeep for Ice Guard units? Well, you shouldn't fall into the trap in thinking that an Ice Guard Doomstack is a worthwhile army in Katarin's campaign. Because while a couple of them will be worthwhile in an army, getting a combination of Ice Guard, Akshinas, maybe Streltsy, Armor, Cossards, or Tsar Guard, and others is the best army Kislev can get. You want the variety. Whereas Full on Ice Guard, yeah, full on Ice Guard are not going to be that great. They lack armor piercing, they lack melee durability, they lack ranged damage. They're just not going to be able to deliver what you expect them to. Like, Katarin was the first campaign I finished in Warhammer 3 on Legendary when ROC came out. And I played with that army. It isn't as good as the alternative. What about her special skill line when we're thinking about it? Well, she lacks the melee skill line, so her Warbear, Embodiment of Water, and all that, kind of meaningless. She does have one good benefit. Like, okay, she can get Ice Mistress, but the problem with Ice Mistress is that, yes, cooldown to spells is useful. With the magic cost to all spells is useful, absolutely. But the only thing that I would say is really worth it over here is to get Shield of Ice. Everything else, not really important. Con Queen is also, by the way, significantly worse than Paracelsus has as the diplomacy benefit. Though the control benefit you get kind of worth a bit, but Katarin already has far more control than anyone else, so it's redundant. What about her magic? She's supposed to be one of the most powerful casters in the world, except her magic sucks. Now, there are obviously benefits to some of this magic, but first off, she's not that great of a caster. She only reduces the Winds of Magic cost by 1 to these spells. That's not what a great caster does, because they're Drazov, for instance. So Ice Mistress, not really that great. The cooldown is beneficial. The Winds of Magic cost is nice, I suppose, but it just doesn't end up being that particularly powerful. Suffice to say, when you are playing in a campaign as Katarin, it is far better to get a Tempest Mage and get the Hawks of Miska, for instance, and use that spell as opposed to casting any spell over here, except maybe Heart of Winter, though I would personally argue that the Tempest magic is significantly better than Ice magic, and that's always been the case. This is not new. So she's not a great caster, she's not a great melee combatant, her army isn't great, her lord effects aren't great, her faction effects are meaningless. Yeah, Katarin is a worthless Legendary Lord. Every other Legendary Lord of Kislev is significantly better to play than her. And Kislev is not a great race, but if you want to play the support race, Kastalin is in a significantly better position for that. Paracelsus is substantially better than both of them together, because he doesn't have to deal with like the crappy campaign victory conditions, which by the way affect both Kastalin and Katarin. So Katarin ends up being far weaker, by the way, because free hero capacity is pretty powerful, but the fact you require 600 supporters, which realistically requires over 100, you to take over 100 different settlements, because you get 5 per Urson. So this short campaign victory requirement is completely bonkers in every way. It affects Kastalin, but Kastalin has better effects in other places as well. Also, Katarin, out of the two cities between Erengrad and Kislev, Kislev is a far worse city than Erengrad. So, worthless lord, horrible campaign, bad design. She really needs an update. She hasn't really ever gotten one. And number 4 is Lord Mazdamundi of the Lizardmen. Mazdamundi, I'm not sure I would even consider him a Legendary Lord at this point. He's kind of just there, and he doesn't really add a huge amount in his campaign. Lizardmen are a mediocre race. They're not horrible. They are playable. You can beat the campaign with them. It won't feel horrible to do so, but they do have severe limitations. It's less of a case of reworks, more of a case of needing fixes in their campaign, but regardless. Now, Mazdamundi, he gets a -10 diplomatic relations with most factions, so he gets an additional -10 aversion with most factions, which isn't really a great dynamic to be dealing with in your campaign. Beyond that, he just reduced his right costs by 30%, and he gets 50% construction costs for Star Chambers. Now, reducing our right costs only really matters for the sake of the right of primeval glory, which is not worth it the most of the time, because it's, unless you're talking about late game, and even then, it's more so the cost of maintaining the freaking army that spawns, rather than the cost of the right itself. As for the idea of Star Chambers, well, the idea that Star Chambers are that expensive. Like you drop them from 3,000 to 1,500, and you don't. And while they're useful in a campaign, absolutely. So it's like kind of meaningless as a benefit. I mean, it's not completely worthless. You do get a hero recruit rank, which is kind of worth it in the end once you increase a lot of capacity. But at this particular point, I would say, like, it just isn't really worth it. Okay, so faction effects are meaningless. Faction situation. Well, he's in the middle over here with Marafi to the north. It's a decent enough situation, though it is a miserable early game. You have a greater demon of Slaanesh over here with the Keepers of Bliss, who might just wipe out the entire starting army on his own, or her own. You start a war with Keskegi, and are going to be really annoying as they do start with tier 2 settlements, so they're going to get a lot of Marauder Berserkers and Champions, especially because they have that Great Hull, which, yeah, that gets annoying. Like, it is lovely having to deal with Marauder Champions from the early game. You can do it, again, just more of a case of an annoyance rather than anything else. Marafi you can work with, you can stabilize the situation there, make it work from a diplomatic standpoint, but make no mistake, this is one of the worst starting positions of any Lizardman campaign. Now, when controlled by the AI, Mazdamundi does end up dominating this situation for the most part, but that doesn't make it a great experience to deal with as the player. Lord effect-wise, you do get some experience benefit, an upkeep benefit for Temple Guard, so that's late game benefit if you get a lot of Temple Guard in an army. Temple Guard are worth it, but still, just his own army just affects one army. He does get targeting range of spells and Winds of Magic Power Reserve. In terms of his skill line, he just gets Ruination of Cities and Banishment. He doesn't have any faction effects or anything like that in his skill line. He can reduce the Winds of Magic Power Reserve of enemies, but the benefits here are incredibly limited in a campaign. So effectively, Mazdamundi, he's certainly not worth playing. He's not really worth it all that much to even confederate in a campaign. He adds absolutely nothing. He's like the generic lord for the Lizardmen, but we consider other generic lords. We consider Malekith for the Dark Elves. We consider Tyrion for the High Elves. We consider Queek, I guess, for the Skaven. They do have their own unique playstyles, and those playstyles can work fairly well. Mazdamundi just adds very, very little to his faction, to his campaign. Like, you could remove Mazdamundi and you wouldn't necessarily feel it all that much in the campaign. Like, just get the generic Slan Mage Priest from the Ritual. That's how meaningless Mazdamundi is in a campaign. Like, later on with the Mount, sure, once you get to rank 18, absolutely, that's a bit of a different ball game, but until that point, not quite exactly exciting as a lord. Now, number 3, and the overwhelming favorite, according to the poll, is Tretch Craventail. Now, I would put Tretch Craventail at the top, but here's the thing. While Tretch is certainly a joke of a legendary lord, he is bad in numerous ways in a campaign. And while I have certainly played this campaign, and it can be fun doing so because Skaven are still ultimately Skaven, Tretch is kind of nonsensical as a legendary lord. Let's consider the situation. Ignore the massive tooltip over there. It's kind of a mess right now with some of these tooltips. So he gets an improved Scurry Away. He gets permanent benefits effectively in his campaign because you're going to have this war effect for virtually all of your campaigns. So Vanguard deployment, Menace below, enemy reinforcement high. Like, this stacks. So the more wars you declare, the more you're going to keep it going. So ambush success chance, Vanguard deployment, Menace below, enemy reinforcement time. Now, enemy reinforcement time and Menace below, not necessarily that important. Vanguard deployment and ambush success chance, however, very much so. But it just doesn't really feel that meaningful of a benefit over there. And yeah, there's certainly some bugs there. He does get devastating flanker on all units in his army, so you can certainly make a really powerful melee army with Tretch. Now, he does get 13 melee attack after retreating when attacked, and 13 melee attack during ambushes. And he does have that ambush benefit. So when you're playing a campaign as Tretch, you always have to remember the fact that Tretch gets a stacking benefit that will last for a very long time with that declaration of war. That's the reason, the only reason, that Tretch is not number 1 on this list. But outside of that, he, and the devastating flanker being pretty powerful. Now, beyond that, he also gets Tretch's Raiders, but the issue with a lot of his benefits in his campaign, he gets a lot of benefits for Clan Rats and Servant Vermin, which are the units you really, really don't want to use. He doesn't really have great items, he doesn't have great anything in his campaign. So there's the problem when we're talking about Tretch. Isn't pure misery as a campaign, you can do it, but of all of the Legendary Lords of the Skaven, while Ikeclaw and Fraught do have horrible starting situations, they do work quite well as Legendary Lords. Tretch's benefits, they don't really feel that great, with the exception of the ambush 6 chance, because yeah, that does give Skaven in particular a huge benefit with it. So regardless, it's not really a great race, it's not a great campaign. You're kind of playing a generic lord for the Skaven in a lot of ways when we're talking about Tretch, which is not necessarily horrible when we're dealing with it. Just a generic lord with some flanking benefits, melee attack benefits if you're retreating and attacked after that, and permanent vanguard deployment and ambush success chance. Not the worst situation in the world, but certainly one of the worst in Warhammer 3. At number 2 is Skarsnik, the Warlord of 8 Peaks. See, here's the thing. While I understand why people voted Tretch for the number 1 position in the poll, ultimately, Skarsnik actually ends up being significantly worse when we're talking about the campaign situation. Not only is Skarsnik not good as a Legendary Lord, he is an active detriment to your campaign in a lot of ways that shouldn't be ignored. So let's talk about the ways that Skarsnik is a genuine detriment during the course of a campaign situation. So first off, Skarsnik cannot recruit Orc units unless he was recruiting them from Karak 8 Peaks. But this is not just an issue of recruitment, by the way. He also can't have garrisons of Orc units unless we're talking about like things like Karak 8 Peaks itself. So he's going to have Night Goblins. So his garrisons for the Greenskins are actually the worst garrisons for the Greenskins of every single campaign, just because of the limitation on Orcs. And also, when we're talking about Orcs, he actually doesn't just get limited from the perspective that he can only recruit the Orcs from one particular settlement, which is already a limiting factor for the Greenskins because their recruitment capacity is tied to how many settlements are in a particular province, and Karak 8 Peaks only has 2 settlements. But on top of that, in every other Greenskin campaign, you can recruit Black Orcs to tier 4. In Skarsnik's campaign, you require a tier 5 settlement from a structure that takes 30 fucking turns to build. Yes, 30 turns. I don't know about you, but assuming this kind of situation, like I just captured Karak 8 Peaks here, it's gonna take you until turn 80 or so, or close to turn 80, to achieve the Black Orc recruitment. It will be 70 turns at least, because you're not going to have the structure in Karak 8 Peaks. It's probably going to be 70 turns, maybe let's say 60 if you really rush Karak 8 Peaks, if you want to do so. It would not necessarily be a great idea in Skarsnik's campaign. You could get like Black Orc, or you can get Orc Biggins. So really a absolutely terrible campaign dynamic to deal with Skarsnik from an Orc recruitment perspective. He also suffers on the level of control until he takes Karak 8 Peaks. His WAs are not especially strong either. You might think Doom Divers and WAs could be considered great. I would not necessarily consider them that really powerful, personally. Like, I have some issues. And it's not like, yeah, you know, you can get 1 unit of Doom Divers, 2 units of Doom Divers. But, like, I'd rather have Black Orcs, like Grimgore does get during a WA. And you're not necessarily going to guarantee more than 1 or 2 Doom Divers in an army. So 1 artillery piece may seem powerful, but Greenskins kind of don't need artillery. Now, then he has hero action cost minus 50%. This is worthless because when we're talking about heroes, even as races the Greenskins who can get a lot of heroes, you want to keep them in an army. The one major hero benefit, and only benefit that Skarsnik actually has in this campaign that's worth anything, is the fact that he gets double character experience. So his heroes are leveling up significantly faster. This is not a minor affair. In fact, in point of fact, it is a substantial benefit because you end up with fairly high-ranking heroes. You can drown your enemies in Tide of Heroes. So if you want to make a lot of hero armies as Greenskins, Skarsnik might actually be the best choice for that. That's kind of it, though, when we're talking about his benefits. Now, people will always argue one way or another about the upkeep and recruitment cost for Goblin units. I personally find the entire benefit meaningless. And the reason I find this particular benefit meaningless in a campaign boils down to this fact. Goblins are fairly cheap units to recruit and maintain regardless of this benefit. It's not meaningless as a benefit, but you're saving maybe 700 to 1,000 gold in an army, assuming the army is made up purely of goblins. And we're talking here anything from regular goblin archers to nasty skulkers to night goblin fanatics that get that kind of discount. Now, 1,000 gold when a greenskin army, well, let's say right here I do have 6 armies. 1,000 gold may seem a lot, but it's actually a trap. Because yes, for every, let's say, 2.5 armies, you can maintain an additional one when you're playing a Skarsnik campaign, assuming it's made up purely of goblins. The reason this doesn't really work out, and the reason this is actually a detriment, or rather, it doesn't end up being as good as you might think it is because Goblin upkeep is not the issue in a greenskin campaign. Goblins are cheap. You play Grimgore, you play Azag, you play Warzag. It ain't the goblins that are bankrupting you, suffice to say. It's the other units in the campaign. It's the heroes that are causing you upkeep issues. If Skarsnik had a 40% upkeep and recruitment cost for heroes, that would be substantial. He doesn't have it. If he had a 20% upkeep reduction for heroes, goblins, and trolls, like basically all the non-orc units, that would be very substantial and would be worth it. But just reducing the upkeep of already some of the cheapest units in the entire game is not really that huge of a benefit, because you still want to get things like trolls and stone trolls during the course of a campaign. That particular dynamic doesn't change. We have to, that has to be understood. And things like stone trolls, like you look at this army, okay, so the nasty skulkers, goblin archers, they're not really expensive. But then we have these 4 trolls at 330 upkeep each with 20% increased upkeep from supply lines. So this is where the issue is. I'm paying over almost half this army cost is actually certainly half the army cost is not the goblins. It's the trolls and the giant river troll hack. This is why the benefit for goblin upkeep is not really as substantial. Yes, you can make more goblins, or maybe you can get an extra army of goblins every 2.5 armies and just have that following your main armies around. Sure enough, but ultimately I will argue very strongly in favor of the idea that it doesn't really end up being that great. Even worse, because we're not done here with Skarsnik, even worse, he has a skill here that if you're someone who doesn't understand this, you might think this is a good skill. It is not. It's actually worthless. And that's the underbosses. So he steals 25% experience earned by other lords. Now in Warhammer 1, where you had limited armies, this wasn't too bad. But in Warhammer 3, where it's all about getting as many armies with as high level heroes and lords as possible, this is a genuine nerf in your campaign. See, Skarsnik's campaign was already in a trouble spot. They updated the starting position, but they did nothing to update the skill line to make sense in the context of Warhammer 3. This is a guy who had the power of Lightning Strike, and now is incredibly important in Warhammer 1 and 2, because it gave him a lot more power. However, he doesn't have... Lightning Strike is no longer important in Warhammer 3. You might say, oh, he has great goblins. Well, the problem is he has great goblins in ambushes, but the greenskins, like, but if he had the stock stance, which he doesn't, that might be worth it. Again, he does not have a stock stance, so his actual power with ambushing is going to be limited. You can still use it, you'll be better when you're doing it, but let me put it like this. A regular goblin Great Shaman is actually better than Skarsnik, because a Goblin Shaman doubles the army of Goblin Nasty Skulkers. That is significant, or doubles the baseline armor. And you can, of course, obviously get a bit more armor for research, like things like use them in a campaign. So, Skarsnik's benefits are meaningless, his skill line is worthless, his Lord effect is not great. It is a genuine detriment to play Skarsnik. It is a genuine detriment in your campaign to confederate Skarsnik as the greenskins. The only thing that he has that's worthwhile is that character experience gain, not the upkeep benefit, because it's affecting units that are already cheap enough. If it was affecting trolls and other units, I would agree that is worth it. But you look at a minus 40% upkeep benefit and recruitment benefit, and you find that that's substantial. Let me tell you this. I've played a lot of greenskin campaigns in Warhammer 3. You generally don't have financial issues, right, in any of them. But I actually have discovered that the so-called benefit that Skarsnik has actually kind of ends up a detriment, because you think you can push harder than you actually can. You will not push more armies than you would in other greenskin campaigns, because heroes, trolls still are going to cost the same. And that is certainly something that I've discovered in an unfortunate fashion in this experience. Like, what I'm saying here is Azak, Grimgor can get more money because they have more post-battle loot. Grom literally prints money. Warzak, yeah, okay, he's not that great, but he's at least a generic lord. He doesn't have downsides. Well, he's a generic lord with some Savage Orc benefits, but still. Skarsnik has a genuine detriment to play. You can enjoy him if you so desire, but I make the argument that he's kind of bad. He's really, really bad as a Legendary Lord. And finally, at number 1, it is Ungrim, Iron Fist of the Dwarves. Yes, surprise Ungrim at the top of the list. I refuse to add Daniel to any list, because Daniel is just genuinely not even a character anymore as I see it. He's so utterly broken and without any hope of redemption that he doesn't even deserve to exist. If there was a mod to literally remove him from the game, I would install it. There probably is somewhere along the lines. Just haven't checked for that. But of the actual legendary lords that exist in this game, Ungrim is by far, in a way, the most worthless legendary lord in the entirety of Warhammer 3. I can harp on a lot about Tretch and Skarsnik, but at least they have some benefits. A lot of downsides in Skarsnik's case, absolutely, but there are at least some things that do work in those campaigns. Ungrim is not a legendary lord. He's like a more powerful melee combatant of the generic dwarf lord with a two-hand weapon as opposed to a sword, as opposed to an axe and shield. That is literally Ungrim. He's heavily armored, he does a lot of damage, he's good in combat, he's unbreakable because he's a freaking slayer. Sure. But his actual combat prowess leaves a significant amount to be desired. And why do I say this? Well, faction effect-wise, he can reduce the construction cost of 75% for Slayer buildings. And he also gets a recruitment cost of 50%, a 50% recruitment cost benefit for Slayer units, and 10% speed for infantry units, which obviously does mesh well with Slayers. The problem, though, is when we're considering this, Slayers are not really worth using as a unit in a campaign. Yes, you can get them far cheaper than anyone else, but they're just not really worth it. Because even in Ungrim's case, with Slayers are too freaking expensive to really use en masse. There is a banner that reduces their upkeep even further, so you can get the minus 50% upkeep for his own army. But the problem is, when we're considering the benefits that he gets for Slayers, he gets Journey's End, which has been bugged for such a long time. It's funny. It's ridiculous. He does get Doomseekers, which gives Slayers 15% casualty replenishment and charge bonus, so that's pretty nice. But the problem is, Slayers just are not worth using as a unit. Dwarven army, such as it is, for all the problems of the dwarves can have a really powerful army. I've showcased what you can do with them in a 4-gram campaign. You can conquer an enormous portion of that faster than cast dwarves if you're willing to tolerate a lot of the crap shit that happens in a dwarf campaign. And there's a lot of it, make no mistake on that. Thing about Ungrim is his playstyle is not great. Dwarves excel at two things. They excel with masses of quarrelers, they excel with masses of artillery. That is the Dwarven army. Slayers are not good. They take too much damage, they're too vulnerable, and yes, even with casualty replenishment, they're just not really worth using during the course of a campaign. That's simply a fact. And so you have a guy who has Slayer benefits, and they're meaningless in a campaign because, well, you don't want to use Slayers. The best thing you can do as Ungrim, yes, you would recruit some Slayers in his army initially, because you do start with the Slayer Shrine of Karakar. But once that's done, you actually do want to move on to recruiting quarrelers and artillery en masse, and just kind of play Ungrim as the generic lord. Journey's End is a mess. The problem is also that a lot of the effects Ungrim has are like buffing melee attack and bonus versus large one is. In reality, what Slayers really need to be more useful is, and for Ungrim's Slayers to be more useful, would be something like physical resistance on a campaign-wide scale. You're supposed to be playing the Slayer faction. Well, give the factions a faction-wide benefits for Slayers. That is the problem. Now, Ungrim does have some really nice quest items that you can use, but he's just really ultimately a buffed-up generic lord with a focus on a playstyle that you really, really don't want to use in a campaign. Furthermore, he starts with a grudge meter that's like basically half full. Like, you can get irked, that's not a problem, and you can even get satisfied, but we look at the grudges that Ungrim has. He has to take the Silver Pinnacle, which means going out of his way. He has to wipe out Azag, basically. He has to go to war with Vlad. Having to pick a fight above Vlad and Azag is not a great experience. In reality, you're not going to do even that, because one of the problems in Ungrim's campaign is this. Forgrim has a high chance of getting wiped out when you're not playing him as a dwarf. This is one of the reasons you want to play Forgrim, by the way. Grombrindle might be very squishy as well, sure, but at least he's on the other side of the planet. Forgrim being wiped out actually does genuinely affect you in a dwarf campaign. So if you're thinking about playing Belegar or Ungrim, then I'm going to say it plainly, Forgrim is significantly better to play as a dwarf lord, because Ungrim and Belegar, in part because Ungrim and Belegar, when controlled by the AI, actually have a far higher survivability chance. Whereas Forgrim does tend to lose the fight against Skarsnik in more ways than one. And then usually, like if both Forgrim and Ungrim are controlled by the AI, Skarsnik gets wiped out by Ungrim. That I've seen that happen multiple times. It's a question of his it's a question of his position being saved by AI standards, but for you to succeed in this campaign, keep in mind, the AI has a different dynamic than you because the other AI factions are going to declare war far more on you than they would on another AI faction. Also, the AI cheats, so don't ignore the fact the major upkeep, growth, casualty replenishments the AI gets, especially on a higher difficulty. The issue with Ungrim is you're basically going to have to take the Deadrock Gap to then to a secure Forgrim, and since you're there, you might as well go deal with Tretch. So you're gonna end up kind of here dealing with Drazov with Ungrim while ignoring Azak, Vlad, and the other grudges in the Silver Pinnacle and all that. So That is not a great campaign dynamic, but it's the best plan you got because it's the one that achieves the best possible results in your campaign. And you end up with a vast array of territory that's vulnerable, and you're playing a generic lord up against the Darklands. Let me put it like this. Ungrim doesn't have a cakewalk of a campaign, but at least he can contain Tretch, right? While he does with other things. As Ungrim, you can possibly do the same thing, sure, while you go deal with Asa. Like, you could just deal with Skarsnik and then start recruiting a secondary army, maybe get Gotrek and Felix, hold the line against Tretch, let them do their thing, is a strategy in a campaign. But you kind of just want, if you have to end up fighting Azag and Vlad, just for the sake of grudges, that is not a great campaign experience, suffice to say. Actually, it's probably better to some extent to leave them be and focus, yes, on marching on the Darklands. But you're going to end up surrounded by factions on all sides, which, again, is not a great campaign dynamic. So on every level, faction effects, lord effects, campaign dynamic, hell, even his own race, Ungrim is just really, really, really terrible. At least the others, all the others on this list have some genuine benefit for you to use. Either an army benefit or a faction benefit, or both more often than not. Even if it's not the particular one. Like, Katarin at least has that ward save for her entire army, even if everything else is pretty worthless. Mazdamundi does have that Temple Guard benefit. The Tretch has that ambush benefit. Skarsnik has that character experience benefit. Ungrim has absolutely no benefit except his own personal dueling ability, because the Slayers are just not worth it. Some of his items are nice, but you can get those by confederating him, so make of that what you will. Questine, signing out.